And we're on air.
And we're live. Well, thank you so much for the people who are joining us live here on the Consumer Choice Center. You can follow us on the different platforms. You might be on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. So thank you so much for joining us. And of course, if you haven't yet, please like our pages and follow us on Twitter and so on. Today, we are talking about flying. And the title of today's broadcast is For Mother Nature, Should We Stop Flying? And of course, we want all of your comments and feedback. So for that, you can use the different platforms to ask us questions, and we'll be seeing those and hopefully respond to those in time. I am joined today by Fred Roeder, who is the Managing Director of the Consumer Choice Center and a very regular, very frequent flyer, and also by Gary Leff, who runs the blog View from the Wing, which is and he talks about all things miles and points and different issues that are interesting to frequent flyers. He also covers controversies around airplanes, or if it's news around airplanes. So you can check that out as well. We'll be putting all of that info down as well for all of you guys. So. And just to introduce myself as well, my name is Bill Wirtz, and I'm a policy analyst for the Consumer Choice Center. And I'm not that regular of a frequent flyer, so I'm pretty much an amateur compared to these two gentlemen. And we'll be jumping right in it because we have a couple of things that I think we should cover. A lot of things are being said about flying in recent days for those of you who are following the news. So we have a couple of questions that we want to ask to our two experts on our chat today. So. To dive right into it, and we'll have a couple of questions each, and hopefully we'll have some feedback if we have any time left over. So, Fred, I just wanted to start with you briefly. In the European Union, we see multiple calls to curb air travel. We're being told that people are flying too much and flying too low cost. What can you tell us about the latest proposals? Tell us a bit what is being floated right now in politics.
Yes, hello everyone. Let me go from bad to ugly to terrible. Like my three top proposals right now, which are out there in Europe, I'm really concerned about is probably the first proposal comes from the Dutch government, which pushes for a European-wide air passenger departure tax of at least €7 per departure within the European Union. It's kind of interesting because the Netherlands actually used to have a passenger tax, and they got rid of it because they saw that people were going to Belgium, or back then also Germany, when Germany didn't have a passenger tax, to fly out from there. But now the Dutch government actually wants to introduce it again in a couple of years. But since they're aware that maybe some passenger flows might go to neighboring countries, some of the neighboring countries actually do have passenger departure taxes. But that's why they would like to have a union-wide tax. So national governments would be forced to implement that tax, which would be one of the first really EU imposed taxes on the nation states or member states. And looking at that, maybe we can later talk a bit more about this, but especially poorer EU countries, basically every Eastern European country, most Southern European countries don't actually have these taxes. It's more something you have in Germany, soon in the Netherlands again, something you have in the UK, actually really hefty passenger departure tax. But the work migrant, the bartender who works in a Brussels bar and flies on every other weekend back to Bucharest, his hometown, usually doesn't have to pay this tax when leaving on a Wizz Air flight from Bucharest to Charleroi, and that flight might be just €20. So if you add a €7 tax, that's actually a 30% increase of the fare, which is massive, right? I mean, this is the elasticity of this demand might actually be much higher in Eastern Europe, and there must be a reason why a lot of countries, also tourism-dependent countries such as Greece or Spain, have not introduced these taxes. So that's like currently actually seriously being discussed among EU member states to introduce this tax. And of course, all countries who already have that tax would love to see countries who don't have that tax to introduce it, because then they don't have to compete for where passengers depart. And the probably next proposal I'm really concerned about is like bounced around by the German Greens, which some leading politicians of the German Greens in the German parliament have actually suggested that every citizen or resident of Germany should only be entitled to 3 return flights a year. So if you have maxed your 3 return flights because you had to go to 1 wedding, 1 funeral, and 1 birthday party in a different part of Germany or a different part of Europe, you actually have to ask people who have not fully used their 3 return permissions or permits to trade them with you. So it'd be a bit like cap and trade, which is like a massive social engineering of people's freedom to move. And we have the European Union. We spend billions of telling students to study abroad, but then actually when people travel and have a lifestyle, maybe they have a partner in a different country or they have a job where they need to travel a lot, suddenly this gets really hard. And probably the most funky reaction in Europe currently towards innovation in air travel is that Europe actively tries to block the rollout of new supersonic planes. Last month, there was a meeting in Montreal by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, where the EU tried to block, or actually successfully blocked, some reforms when it comes to emissions and noise of supersonic planes. There are currently 3 very promising startups in North America which are actually working on this, and some airlines have already bought options to get some of these planes, and the EU basically doesn't want to see any of this in Europe. And there's probably an unholy alliance of people who think flying is decadent, people who think we fly too much, people who think we fly too fast, and maybe some European competitors who are currently not working on supersonic planes who prefer to not have a new technology to compete against with. But basically what we see is like a plethora of different policy measures and debates on, are we flying too much? Is flying not good for the environment? Should we be forced to use more trains and buses? So maybe something we can talk a bit later about.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of proposals in there, and for some people it seems to make sense. And I wanted to jump to you, Gary, because I've heard this before. I wanted to ask you, the Dutch government, which is pushing for this €7 tax, also believes that the flight from Amsterdam to Brussels should not exist anymore. And they say that this flight is unnecessary, and many people agree. Many people say, why would I take a flight from Brussels to Amsterdam? Run us through the reasons why people use these flights and what happens if we ban them.
Right. So the interesting thing, of course, is that unless you're actually near the airport on one end and needing to be at the airport on the other, it's not going to make a lot of sense to fly between the cities. They're not particularly far away. A train is going to be much more efficient, and so generally speaking, that's what consumers do. Which is why what you have are regional jets, smaller planes that are relatively fuel efficient compared to larger aircraft. They burn less fuel, that are flying, because the people that are taking those flights are generally speaking connecting to long haul destinations. So they're flying from, they're departing their close-in airport. They're connecting through Amsterdam, perhaps to the United States, perhaps to Asia, but they're flying long distances. And so if you take away these flights, several interesting things happen. First of all, it's not that fewer people fly. It likely just means they're not flying KLM, right? So they're going to connect on Lufthansa. They're going to connect on British Airways, other carriers. It doesn't take away the demand for flying, because you've got people that are generally flying long. These flights, generally speaking, make sense, except for a couple of outlier cases. If, say, you've got a meeting at the airport, interestingly, of course, when you're dealing with space-constrained airports with a limited number of takeoffs and landings, I mean, one of the arguments being made for this proposal is, well, gosh, couldn't KLM make better use of these slots rather than flying something that's not great for consumers? They could do something that would be better. Well, first of all, I mean, if they had these opportunities, I mean, certainly they would be doing that. They're not flying these out of a Machiavellian belief that it's sort of a way of destroying the environment. In fact, you're going to be flying larger aircraft greater distances instead, burning more fuel, not less. If what you're doing is simply suggesting that they trade off these short flights. Overall, interestingly, many of these proposals that are supposedly pro-environment are actually, pro-large airline, expensive airline, business, right? So, when you have environmental arguments for limiting runway construction, you're benefiting incumbent carriers at the expense of potential new airlines that might compete, that might drive down price. What you interestingly have is then the existing incumbent airlines have valuable assets in the form of takeoff and landing slots that oftentimes just to preserve. We've seen many news stories about Heathrow, what are called ghost flights, airlines that fly just to preserve their takeoff and landing slot rights, without passengers even. And so you have that limitation on flying, on runways, on capacity, leading perversely not to better environmental outcomes. But if you're concerned about those environmental outcomes, you wind up precisely getting flights without any passengers. Similarly, when you impose taxes on departures, those are to the relative benefit of long-haul legacy, more expensive airlines at the expense of at the detriment of the inexpensive carriers, because precisely those taxes are a much greater proportion of the overall fare. They hit discounters more. So really, what you have is the traditional bootleggers and Baptist story of the fig leaf of positive environmental change that may not in fact benefit the environment, but that benefits the incumbent businesses at the expense of smaller, newer competitors.
And maybe to jump to you, Fred, on sort of the regulatory side, because I wanted to talk some more about these taxes that you talked about, but also what Gary just mentioned on these short distance flights. It can't be that the regulators and the politicians who are suggesting this don't know about this. So, Fred, from your perspective, if politicians know about this, is it just a hidden way of saying, oh, if we get rid of these short distance flights, that just makes sense, people don't need these flights, when in reality it can bring much more in consequences? What is their actual policy goal here? What are they trying to do? Could just get people off flying completely?
I mean, that's a really good question. It's definitely not a consumer-friendly policy goal. It's very confusing to me. For instance, the Dutch government just spent close to €1 billion to buy more equity in Air France KLM, so they have as much say as the French government in it. And the same government then announces basically we're flying too much, we should have more high-speed railway. So why do you invest billions of taxpayer, or at least $1 billion on taxpayers' money, if you then think that that business model is overblown and should be like downsized? It's definitely a populist wave of tying air travel with global warming and carbon emissions. And there's a really globally developed carbon emission trading scheme already among airlines. Gary probably knows more about this than I do. But there are already like lots of tools to make sure that airlines and flights are not going to harm the environment more than other ways of transportation. And then we just need to also see that obviously if you just travel between Paris and Brussels or Amsterdam and Düsseldorf, this is something where we already have a really good train infrastructure. It's highly populated areas of Europe. You have only very short distances, usually 200 or 300 kilometers each trip. So this is fairly easy to say, yes, we should have more high-speed rail, especially in areas where it already exists. But then if you, for instance, look at something like going from Bucharest to Barcelona, that is probably a 3-day journey, and not on trains. On train probably takes 5 days, but just on different buses. And hitchhiking or driving a car, and if one person drives a car, that's probably much less efficient than putting people on trains. And you just see it on the price, right? Because you can get a decent seat on a low-cost carrier that is profitable for maybe 60 or 70 euros one way, and that's probably one of the ticket prices where they already start breaking even if the plane is full. That if you just drive your own car, or even if you take a train, it costs 4 or 5 times as much. So it seems to be some bit elitist populism that just arguing in favor of the environment, and the environment is great, but there are also realities of how consumers have to travel, especially if they have to travel further than just a few hundred kilometers, especially if they live in areas that are not so densely populated. I mean, great example is Perth, Australia. That's the most remote city in the world. It's 2,000 kilometers away from the next big city. I mean, how do you want to tell people there not to fly?
Yeah, indeed. And what I find interesting as well is that Finland is supporting the tax. While in Finland, €7 is quite a different amount than for consumers in places like Romania or Bulgaria. So that is indeed concerning. Gary, I wanted to jump to the other side of the Atlantic on this issue. You have all these discussions with the Green New Deal, and the Green New Deal talks quite a lot about flying as well. And I have heard that they want to get rid of flying completely if this bill were to go through in any time soon. Give us a little insight, give us a little summary of what are they actually trying to do with the Green New Deal.
Well, it's not entirely clear what they're actually trying to do with the Green New Deal, because the document itself has changed many times, and many folks, like to endorse the concept but not deal with a lot of the specifics, right? So there is a mindset behind it that embeds not traveling. Self-sustaining communities, which is sort of problematic, because you have much more efficient places where food is grown than others, and trade really does feed the world. Airline cargo as well as ship cargo is incredibly important for human sustainability. Now, I think that the airlines themselves, though, have incredible incentives to conserve fuel. It's roughly speaking, at least a third of the cost faced by an airline is their fuel expense, and as a result, they are driving towards more and more alternative fuel solutions, especially when oil prices are high. Biofuels, for instance, and this is taking place all over the world. Here in the United States, we've seen airlines that have run flights on alternative fuels. We've seen it in New Zealand. Qantas obviously is incredibly focused on this. They fly from Perth all the way to London. This basically entails being a flying gas can. They have their drive to reduce their fuel expense. Now, how do you lots of flying, right? The more the airlines are flying, the greater their incentive to drive to cost-saving alternatives. And it's exactly what we are seeing now. We want the science to advance so that alternative fuels are on par and competitive with fossil fuels. If you make flying less accessible, if fewer people fly, the drive to do that, the incentive to do that, dissipates rather than growing. It's precisely as we see where wealthier countries are driving to both invest in and tax ostensibly for the environment. We want to be in a position where environment can be a top concern. As we mentioned, there are less wealthy parts of Europe that would be disproportionately impacted. We no longer have a national airline of Hungary, for instance, right? Do you really want to limit the ability to offer flights that say Malav Hungarian used to serve? Now, low-cost carriers, of course, are have a Wizz Air, for instance, flies extensively there, but they're the ones that are beaten down the most by these taxes. So how do we get service to underserved communities at the same time as we do focus on the environment? It's precisely by making flying accessible to more and more people, so that science has the opportunity to advance and that there's an economic reason to do so.
There seem to be these suggestions that alternatively people should use high-speed railways, and there's quite some suggestions on that, even though in Europe it is not accessible everywhere. So maybe Fred, on your thoughts, apologies, in Europe, what can we do to connect places that now don't have the rail infrastructure? And if we introduce a tax, could people actually switch to an immediate alternative, such as buses and high-speed trains? And what does that mean for these communities? If I need to go from Spain to Greece, or from Poland to Ukraine, how would people do that in any alternative way?
Yeah, maybe one anecdote. So during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, prior to World War I, the train from Vienna to Lviv in Western Ukraine was faster than it's now. So I think it used to take 14 hours, and now it takes 20 hours to go from Vienna to Lviv. So probably the last century, train planners were not great in improving that experience in many cases. And it's often, of course, very political, because if you have a train line from one country to another, usually these railway companies are at least partially government owned. It's like, who pays for it? It's usually when you also build a bridge or tunnel from one country to another, it's usually who picks up the bill, because it's often not an economic decision by private companies, but a very political decision. which makes it harder to build out train infrastructure, railway infrastructure. At the same time, often population density doesn't really permit or doesn't really allow to make an economic case for high-speed rail between many connection points. I mean, there's now this proposal of a tunnel from Helsinki to Tallinn, two beautiful cities. They want to build this 50-kilometer tunnel. I think it will be longer than the tunnel through the channel between the UK and France. It's a great idea. It's supposed to cost 15 billion. And if they stay already before they've started, it costs 15 billion, probably will cost 25 or 30 billion. The problem is Tallinn's population is 500,000. All of Estonia is like 1.2 million people. Finland, huge country with 5 or 6 million people. So if you just basically, you would have to spend at least the annual GDP of Estonia just to build it. And then the question is who uses it and how much do you need to charge people for to use a tunnel with a train to actually break even at some point. It doesn't, I mean, there's just no economic case to spend so much money to connect so few people. And that is many parts of Europe just the case, that railway infrastructure is really bad. So you would need to spend a fortune and decades to build it out. And second, it's just often there's just no case to connect things with rails. Maybe a country like Japan, where you have like 130 million people on a thin strip, that probably makes more sense to have like high-speed trains there. I've used them in Japan, and they come every 5 minutes and connect the biggest cities. But in most cases in Europe, that probably doesn't really make sense to efficiently connect cities. And you see that at also most freight, at least in Eastern Europe, is done by trucks and not on the rail. It's probably a bit similar to the US. Because population density just doesn't really permit to have a good rail infrastructure. And yes, buses actually have been very revolutionary in the last couple of years. Germany, for instance, liberalized their long-distance bus market a couple of years ago, because initially, for actually 80 years, Germany did not allow bus companies to compete with the national railway company. So the only buses you had were to West Berlin, because there was a special thing that you need to have buses going through East Germany from West Germany. And that stayed as a legacy regulation that bus companies were allowed to operate to Berlin from other cities. But two cities which were connected by a train were not allowed to be connected by a commercial bus. So fortunately, that has been liberalized a few years ago, I believe 5 years ago. And suddenly all these buses like Flixbus emerged, and prices went down a lot. And the train company then also had to finally compete. Because if you just set everything on rail and then you have a monopolist, the prices go really up and skyrocket, and the service is usually terrible. The EU actually still has to do a lot of work on liberalizing the European-wide bus market, and that's definitely a good niche product, especially at the lower end of purchase power for consumers. But again, if you want to go from Bucharest to Barcelona, you don't want to take a bus, because that's a 3-day journey. So for that, flying is the only option. It could be interesting, like what Gary also has to say that about. I mean, he lives in a country which is much more vast than any European country.
Yes, Gary. So what are your thoughts? Can you connect the United States with buses and trains?
Well, it certainly hasn't been the case that that's worked out very well. Our train system is it works in the Northeast between dense population centers, and by works, that is to say, individual trains cover their marginal cost, not necessarily their capital expense. But longer distances, it doesn't work, because taking 150 years to wagon trains, people would die along the way, right? I mean, this is just, not only isn't it an efficient way to travel, it doesn't get people where they need to go, and they opt not to travel that way. Moreover, air travel is simply more reliable than long distance trains in the United States. Amtrak runs cross-country travel both along a northern and southerly route, and incredibly frequently they will wind up busing passengers to and from their final destination just to make up days-long delays. So they'll terminate the train only partway through its journey. They'll bus passengers to as far as the train has made it. We simply don't have the meaningful alternative to traverse long distances by train, and we also know, with respect to bus travel and train travel, that it hasn't been as safe as air travel in the United States and air travel worldwide is incredibly safe. One of the things that we always have to watch out for when we are making air travel more expensive, and especially for shorter journeys, is the idea that people might drive rather than flying. And this is substantially more dangerous. It's known, the effect itself is known as statistical murder, because people will get into more car crashes. People will die when they are pushed to make less safe choices. And it's precisely because air travel is so safe, one of the things that speaks so highly for it. And we really do have to be careful of unintended consequences as we put restrictions or higher costs on safer methods of travel.
I just saw a question pop up there, and I think it's very interesting. Gary, can you just briefly elaborate? How is it that the US doesn't have these low-cost carriers as we have here in Europe?
Sorry, I actually missed the end of that. The end of that question. I think you're asking about low-cost carriers in the U.S. versus in Europe. Interestingly, European low-cost carriers have often describe themselves as following the model of Southwest Airlines, here in the United States, which itself, followed a model of an original intra-California airline when it got started. There were tremendous barriers to Southwest's entry into the market. The ability for them to use congested airport to get gates to fly from, and legal barriers to flying generally. One of the interesting things here in the States is how difficult it is to access congested airports. So Alaska Airlines acquired Virgin America largely for the ability for being able to access airports in congested cities where it couldn't get gates and it couldn't get slots. We do have low-cost carriers here in the U.S. Spirit Airlines, Frontier, Allegiant are very much driving down the cost of air travel, where the major airlines are having to compete on price. Becomes difficult for them access to some of those congested airports where incumbent carriers are able to continue to charge a price premium. So interestingly, in the U.S., airports are almost exclusively government owned and government run, and they're frequently very much follow the direction and instruction of their largest incumbent carriers, and as a result, they'll take steps that keep out some of that competition. Private airport operators' financial incentives are different than a politically run airport. Much of the world, we've seen private ownership in airports. In the U.S., it has been very much the exception. There's a few airports that have gotten permission to try to take certain steps towards privatization, but roughly speaking, we've got Branson, Missouri right now, and that's about it.
Right. What I wanted to, on the topic of low-cost carriers, the criticism right now is that many people are flying because they're bored. And many people take flights that they otherwise wouldn't take because of low-cost airlines, because flying is becoming cheaper, and they're flying because they're just bored out of their minds, and they just take whatever trip they can. So I wanted to bring both of you guys in on that. Fred, maybe first. You're also a frequent flyer. You meet a lot of people. What's your perception? Are people just flying because they're bored?
I've not met people that just fly because they're bored. It's definitely exciting to go on a private trip on vacation, but usually travel is an exhausting, stressful thing to do. So I'm usually happy when I don't have to fly, even though I think aviation is an interesting, and flying and airlines are very interesting. And if you keep yourself busy just looking at the plane types, it makes it a bit more bearable to sit in an aluminium tube with 150 other people at 6 a.m. in the morning. And they're probably what some people want to refer to is that some people fly to requalify their frequent flyer status, and that's usually just because without perks, flying is so harder to bear that some people are eager to spend a couple of more flights a year on the plane just to then have more access to upgrades and bypass the congested security line and these things. But just people just hopping on planes out of boredom, I think is not really happening much. It's more that a lot of people use the opportunity of cheap and efficient flying to go on weekend trips to see other places, and that's great, right? We want that people have the freedom to travel and see new places and get inspired by other parts of the world.
And also, it's not for free that you stay somewhere. Even if you fly somewhere, you might still have to spend some money on food and drink and an hotel room and so on. Gary, you run a blog of people who fly and who use air travel on a regular basis. Given all your experience from that community, what's your take on this issue?
Well, I mean, let's take the most generous or serious version of the argument, which is to say that not all trips are to bring people together in important ways or to attend, funerals and other important life events. That there are trips that are discretionary. And I think, though, if we look at those trips, people will take discretionary trips when travel is at its least expensive, which is to say that people are buying marginal seats that would otherwise go empty. These aren't the travelers that are driving an airline decision to operate flights in the first place. When airlines are operating flights and there are empty seats that would otherwise go empty, they will sell those seats inexpensively because they can never sell that seat again once it's taken off. It's spoiling inventory. So the decision's already been made to fly, and the marginal cost of that additional passenger is low. There, when flight deals are good, you can be pretty darn confident that you're not especially influencing the decision of whether or not to operate a flight on a given route on a given day. It's the more expensive flights that have some bearing on airline decision making in that regard. So it's those discretionary trips that potentially you could say how does the importance of those trips weigh against some other important value, but it's also those trips that have the least bearing on whether you'd make any difference towards that value. Right. So, when you're flying inexpensively or, you're flying on an airline redemption ticket, you can be pretty darn confident that you have, no influence whatsoever on the existence of the flight, and therefore pretty darn well no effect on the environment in any kind of limit. I mean, there's some incremental fuel burn from the mere weight of a passenger, but it's likely to be less of an environmental impact than you would be incurring on the ground if you were, say, walking out and about and had to eat to recoup your energy and maybe had a hamburger or a steak.
Right. I'm not sure if it's cut off there. Oh, okay, fair enough. Sorry, the broadcast was a bit cut off there at the end. Fred, since you started the broadcast, I'm not sure if I see questions or if you see anything that I don't see, but you can put those in if there are any. But I wanted to just tell you that before we get to the last question of those that I had prepared, which is the basic question: like, for Mother Nature, should we stop flying, or is there anything that we can do with the model of air travel that we have right now to improve, or are there alternatives, or is there actually any movement? Is flying really the same way that it was 10 to 20 years ago in terms of environmental impact, or has it actually changed? Maybe the question is to both of you. Maybe Fred, if you had some inputs, so some ideas on that.
Yes, flying is different than 20 years ago. It's actually less harmful to the environment. I mean, there are new planes on the market, more efficient engines, totally new materials. The material science helps so much to make planes lighter. Just recently, this new Airbus A220, which used to be called the C series, is 15% less, 15% more fuel efficient than its comparable planes in that category. So we have more and more innovations, probably also in the entire field of even smaller, like flying drones, like we've seen in Dubai. Uber is like planning or like piloting something in Dubai soon of like one passenger drones for like more like congested urban areas. And this is, of course, only possible if these new innovations are much more efficient, because right now, if you take a helicopter, it costs you a fortune, because these are just extremely inefficient technologies. Yes, so flying has changed. It's more efficient. It will get more efficient with technological progress, which is happening every day. And we should be open to new technologies and new means of transportation, and not go back to things that such as like railways, which we have, like technologies which I have for like 200 years and have not gotten too much more efficient recently.
Gary, what's your take on this? Should we stop flying? Has anything happened technologically?
Right. So, look, should we? I think the overall question is, do we continue to engage? Do we continue to engage in economies of scale? Do we continue to trade with others around the world and become more prosperous as a society? Which I think allows us to be in a position to invest in things like the environment. It's the it's the less developed societies that are often the dirtiest, the most polluting. We've seen the rapid industrialization and China driving a lot of pollution, but we want them to grow so that they're at the place of the rest of the world where we do invest and care a lot more about the environmental effects that we around us. Flying as it's grown, as we've flown longer distances, has become much more fuel efficient. Fred mentioned later generation of aircraft that are lighter and more fuel efficient. In fact, in the US, we now have the longest flight in the world, Singapore Airlines, Newark to Singapore. They used to fly it with an Airbus A340 that was basically just uneconomic because of how much fuel it burned. They returned to the market because they can now do the flight with very much match what we want them to be, which is that airlines will fly more and longer distances when they are more fuel efficient. We're constantly driving towards more efficient fuel technologies, but also more efficient engines. The Airbus A321neo, right, new engine option, is incredibly popular. Airlines simply can't get them enough or quickly enough because they could burn a lot less fuel. They're more efficient engines. This is the technological drive that is demanded by a robust and growing air travel network, and where constraints force and higher costs force airlines to keep in the sky the older, less fuel efficient planes that they've been flying. They're not in a position to buy newer aircraft. So you want a healthy air travel industry if what you care about is a continuing improvement in the way that we travel that's consonant with a healthy environment.
All right. So Fred, I'm not sure if you see any of the questions. Maybe we see all the same. But if there aren't any, we're already longer than the 30 minutes that I wanted to have this for. Is there anything that you'd like to add, both Fred and Gary? Is there anything you think that people also need to know?
So just I head now to my train to take the Eurostar from Brussels to London. So sometimes I also take trains because sometimes they actually make more sense. Having competing different ways of transportation is probably the best solution for people with different preferences, for urban and non-urban areas, for heavily congested areas. The one problem of London is also that you can just not fit much more planes into that airspace. So yes, let's just not dogmatically reject one technology or one means of transportation.
Gary, any conclusions on your side?
No, I think that we care about the environment when we advance as a society, which includes being connected as a society, exchanging goods, exchanging ideas, and we don't want to give up the advances that have been made, or for that matter, freeze or retard the aviation industry, which is getting increasingly more efficient and has every incentive to do so. That I don't think that micromanaging the particulars of routes and flights is a very good way to do it, because it has really bad potential negative consequences for the environment. And we have to be really careful with individual policies that they may sound good for the environment, but when you really look at them, actually are pushed by or benefit the largest existing incumbent airlines. Oftentimes there's very much a confluence of the interests of incumbent players to benefit their profits and to convince you, oh gosh, well, I'm giving them more money and it's good for the environment. Well, I think that to the extent that we have more flights and lower cost flights, that forces them to innovate rather than allowing them to be complacent with the status quo.
All right, thank you so much to both you and Fred on this issue. I think it was very interesting. We covered a lot of different topics. For those of you listening and watching who have more questions, you can also reach out to these two gentlemen. I'm pretty sure they will not mind being tweeted at. That's at Gary Leff and also at Fred Cyrus Roeder. And of course, please also follow us on Twitter at Consumer Choice Center. So that's Consumer Choice C. And please like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram. And also do follow Gary's blog, which is View from the Wings. So you have all the updates on his blog as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, both of you gentlemen, for taking the time. And hopefully we'll have another conversation soon on the new developments, because there's a lot happening and we have a lot to say about it. So thank you so much.